Good evening. I think it's fair to say that during our sort of recent history, there have been very few people who've made a special study of the city in the way that, let's say, people like Aldo Rossi or Colin Rowe did during the period of 60s and 70s. And I think that the work of Professor Lampugnani is one of the few exceptions to this lack. In tonight's lecture, The History of Urban Planning as a Historical Project, Vittorio asked the question, why do architects need to learn about the history of urban planning? And it's very clear in his work as a historian, as an architect, as a planner, he has really focused and emphasized the fact that it's very difficult, almost impossible, for architects to ignore what has happened in the past, what has happened in terms of the history of the city, and for us, in a sense, to ignore the relationship between architecture and urbanism. I think in his work on the topic of the history of urban planning as a historical project, there is in fact the development of a new method, new modes of thinking about the relationship, about planning, about the city and architecture. Vittorio has been professor in the history of urbanism at ETH in Zurich since 1994, and he's currently the dean of the faculty at ETH. And he has had his own practice since 1980, and among his most important projects are an office building in Block 109 in Berlin, which was constructed between 1991 and 1996, a housing group near Graz, which is currently under construction, and numerous publications, including books entitled Architecture and City Planning in the 20th Century and the Encyclopedia of 20th Century Architecture. Would you please welcome Vittorio Lampugnani?
Thank you very much, Moisen, for your very kind introduction. I hardly failed recognizing myself because it was so positive. And thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great honor and pleasure to speak here at your school. I thought that it might be interesting to try to explain to you, as briefly as I can, the method of work in teaching and research that we have developed in our course of the history of urban planning at the ETH, which is in a way, a rather specific course, because the school, and this is not my invention, I had the privilege of taking a chair that was already there and was already very solidly built. In this school we have an important tradition of, let's say, attention to urban phenomena, of course also triggered by the presence of Aldo Rossi, the very important presence of Aldo Rossi in our school when the Italians chased him away in the 70s. Let me begin with an endeavor to define a little bit things. I know it's a very Swiss way of starting, but I have even being Italian, I seem to have acquired this habit. First of all, what is history, or what makes historical insight, which is what we are looking after. Historical insight is given when a question regarding the past is posed of course, from the perspective of the present. And when this question is answered in a scientific way, that means methodological, in a methodologically correct way. And for this, it is necessary to pose a question in a precise way, and on the basis of a theory that can be, of course, either confirmed or refuted. Then the sources must be analyzed. That is, the remains from which knowledge can be taken up, and finally, an analysis of the sources and the criticism of the sources must lead actually to a historical insight. History, in this definition, is the narration of things that, I'm simplifying a bit, that are past. Theory is a system of statements, of hypothetical statements on a certain field of knowledge, and criticism, well, you know what criticism comprehends all manner of addressing and examining actions, projects, and so on. Of course, these three things, history, theory, criticism, are linkly connected with each other, are independent factors. History is linked with theory because it's not possible to analyze history without going into a theoretical discourse. Theory is linked with history because every theory is rooted in a certain historical moment, and so on. And it's clear that criticism depends as much on history as it does on theory. So much for the term history. The term city is also, I think, quite complex term. Instead of boring you with a definition, which I could actually, because we have some hypotheses of definitions, I should like to make a detour in a way, and show you how the development of a city indeed depends on many different factors, and how maybe through this detour and through these factors it is possible to explain a little bit more, or understand a little bit more what a city is. I think that these factors have to be examined in order to understand the subject of our discourse, and the subject is, why has a city taken up a specific form and not another one? The important thing is to make very clear is that a city does not grow like a plant. It is always shaped by human hand, and what people do with the city is never arbitrary. It always has reasons, sometimes very odd reasons, sometimes very irrational reasons, but it always has reason. There is not one line in a city that you cannot explain, even if the explanation is, let's say, weird. Now comes the IQ test. I failed it. Let me see. No. I can. I have some chances. Let's try to analyze a little bit the influences on the city. The first influence is topography. It is very clear that the place where a city is established is very well chosen. For instance, you have on your left Regensburg, one of the many cities founded for obvious reasons on a river around the bridge, and to the right you have a very famous painting by Simone Martini, showing Tuscan cities built on tops of hill, and also for very obvious reasons of defense and and health. And it is clear that that the place where a city is built influences the form that a city takes. We speak about hills. We speak about I think now I completely failed the. No. Yes. No. Yes. It's the blue. It's not the white. It's the blue. Thanks. We've spoken about hills. We've spoken about rivers. We could speak about streets. What you see on the left is obviously Las Vegas. It in a way has been generated by a street. It's a roadside city. Or to the right, an example that's also well known to you. It's Euralil, Bayern Kohlhaas. That is, it is a city generated by mainly by a station that. I think this is too difficult for me. No. By a station that you can see here, and by a series of complex infrastructural devices. So this is one. The type of soil is also quite important for the form of a city. One example, very obvious example, Venice, built on marshy island in lagoon. That means very dense city, and with a very interesting construction device that you can see on your right, that we cannot go into in detail, but that allows the houses to slowly sink and the walls to change their direction, so that they are not 90 degrees without falling apart. Or again, the question of the soil. To your left, Berlin, built on sand, basically, used to be, at least for a long time, a city with a rather low building high, exactly 22.5 meters, while on your right, Manhattan is very evidently a city of skyscrapers, and it's a city of skyscrapers in certain points, that is downtown and midtown especially, that is where the granite soil of which Manhattan, the island of Manhattan is formed, arrives at a surface, that meaning that it's very easy to build strong fundaments for this enormous buildings. There is, of course, a kind of exception. These are cities built in places where that are endangered by earthquake. To the left, you see the plan of Lisbon, after which Lisbon was built after the big earthquake of 1755. And I show you this because of this earthquake, this plan, well, first of all, it was possible to rebuild the whole center of the city from scratch because it was destroyed by the earthquake, but it was built in such an orthogonal way, and with, for that time, rather big streets, because the idea was to make this new city secure against earthquakes. So, for instance, 90 degrees angles in the walls give more stability than other corners, and wide streets allow the house to fall down without taking with it the neighbor house. The same applies for Tokyo. You can see a very dramatic image of one of the many earthquakes that that have taken place in Tokyo. This is an earthquake of 1855, and you can see on the right the result of a building code that was that was written down because of the earthquake. Every house is independent from the other house. No house can share a wall with its neighbors for static reasons. Another influence are the materials in the area. One example that is very well known to you, Bath, for instance, you can see the crescent, one of the crescents in Bath, and the tail built of limestone, because limestone is quarried very nearby, and it's very easy or it was very easy to to obtain it, while other cities, or another city to the left, Santiago de Compostela, in a way a granite city of a beautiful yellowish granite, because in Galicia granite is very easily available in the quarries. There are situations where this is not the case. To your right you have Siena, and so Siena happens to be a city completely constructed in brick. The climate also plays an important role. I show you just one example: Bologna, a city where the summer is rather hot and the winters are rather rainy, especially for Italian standards, and so where a system, you can see it on the plan to your left, and you can see an example of it to your right. A system of arcades has been developed, a very large system. It's almost 40 kilometers of arcades all over the city, that allow you, well, to walk around without the problem of getting wet or getting too hot. There are modern versions of the same thing. One is Montreal, very cold climate. You have an underground, almost completely private actually, underground system connecting the buildings without making it necessary to walk over the street. And you have the same thing in Calgary on the right, but not underground, but on the first and second floor, as a system of, again, a rather large system, almost 10 kilometers of skywalks. And finally, this all may sound all very materialistic to you, which it is, but out of all this, out of the climate, the tradition, and so on, cities are shaped by what I would like to call a local culture, by its customs, by its traditions, and cities develop specific forms that are really very emblematic of the city, that of course then are imitated, but first are very emblematic. And one example is London with its squares, that was in a way a kind of urban invention. And to the right you have the galleries, the arcades in Paris, which became a sort of part of the urban imagery of Paris very early in the 19th century, and then of course were imitated as the squares, by the way, all over the world. Let's say this is the more materialistic part of the whole analysis, but it's very obvious that it is not enough to explain, not even nearly, what a city is about. One has to go much further, and for instance look at philosophical influences. If you consider Plato's Politeia, this great treatise on the state, the structure of the state in which man recognizes himself, you can see that this idea of such a state has influenced many not urban visions, but also urban types. I'm showing you here Piraeus, the harbor of Athens, that was planned was very probably evidence that it was planned by Hippodamus of Milet, and here the city structure and also the fabric of the city, meaning this type typified houses here reflects exactly the ideas of Plato's a place for people living on the same rights and having big public spaces that you can see here. It's of course the agorae, where they can meet and create in a way their own state. Then there are religious influence. One again rather famous example, when Sixtus V became Pope, that is in 1585, he got an architect, Domenico Fontana, to create a system of streets. Here you see, let's say, a symbolical representation of the whole thing. You have Santa Maria Maggiore here, and then the most important Catholic churches of Rome, where the pilgrims had to go, and actually they had to go on one day. They had to make all these 7 churches, which was rather complicated, even in practical terms, because the streets in Rome at that time were very narrow and very bad. And so Domenico Fontana was asked to create a system of very straight street. You can see it here symbolically, and in this painting that is in the Vatican, you can still see it in the Vatican Library. You can see what comes out. This is Piazza del Popolo. Here is Santa Maria Maggiore, and you see the system of streets, of straight streets connecting all the churches, so that the pilgrims could walk easily, and of course in a very symbolical way, from one church from the other. By the way, this street here, the Strada Felice, this is a propaganda painting, so this street has never been built. It's not there, but it's painted like we were there because the Pope would have loved to have it. Then obviously there are ideological influences. For instance, the system, quite an incredible system actually, of high-rise buildings. It was forbidden to call them skyscrapers, that were built in the 40s, planned in the 40s and the early 50s under Stalin by a certain number of Russian architects, in order to define a new perimeter of Moscow, and of course in order to be around the Soviet palace, of which you see here, Bayofan, of which you see here, one of the many alternatives, were meant not just as signs in the sea, but as an ideological operation that was exploited by propaganda, as you can see on this poster, where Stalin is the great father of all the new skyscrapers, these new very Russian skyscrapers that were built in Moscow. Then there are political influences. When Louis Napoleon drew the so-called Plan Coloré, which you can see here, unfortunately in black and white because the original was lost, so we have only this copy. This was in 1851. He started, and then the whole thing was realized, as you probably know, by Georges Eugène Haussmann. He started a really political operation. It was, first of all, an operation of speculation in order to satisfy the bourgeoisie. It was the land-owning bourgeoisie that, of course, saw their land value go up. Then it was a job creation measure. Do you say job creation measure? Because the proletariat was, or many of them were out of job, and this operation created many new very simple job in the construction industry. And then it had obviously also, no, this was a mistake. Obviously, also because you can see it very easily here, a direct political or let's say military implication. It allowed the troops to move very quickly from one part of the other of Paris in order to break down resistance against the states, and you can see the troops in action here. Then there are social influences. I think by now it's very clear how mingled all this is. Social influence, for instance, the plan that Cerdà did for Barcelona, that you can see here, is for its time, 1859, an absolutely innovative plan. In fact, it gained, well, it was not a competition, the story is more complicated, but in any case, the counterpart was a radial plan for the extension of Barcelona. The problem was to extend, this was the old city, and it has to be extended like this. And most architects making proposals for this started from the center and went out radially from the center. And so that is exactly the contrary. He did a kind of homogeneous plan, trying to create by a very homogeneous grid and by distributing the infrastructure all over the city, trying to create completely homogeneous urban situation and also values of land. And the explanation, or one of the explanations, is that that Cerdà was an engineer. This doesn't explain anything, but he was a Marxist engineer, and he built this or planned this city for, in a way, the fourth, how do you say, quarto stato. In any case, for the proletariat, as depicted here in this very famous painting by Pellizza da Volpedo. And finally, not finally, we're in the middle. Of course, then there are, and it's almost superfluous to explain it here, there are economic influences. This plan here is a plan of London, obviously, and shows what you cannot see, what is absolutely invisible. It's the pattern of private property boundaries on the outskirts, on what was the outskirts of London in the 18th century. But you can see how this invisible boundaries, like for instance this piece of land owned by the Crown, turn into visible boundaries when they are transformed in Regent's Park by the famous operation that John Nash did and then connected, of course, with Regent Street to the city. There are also technical influences, the famous Siedlungen of the German Siedlungen of the 20s, like what you have here, the Siedlung in Dessau called Dessau-Törten, that was built in 26. Has this linear structure, not only for ideological, aesthetical, and so on reasons, but also because it's constructed exactly and along the rails on which the crane can run, the same crane that is used to build piece by piece, in a way, slice by slide, this whole, partially at least, prefabricated structure. And finally, really finally now, for the beginning, there are cultural influences. If you consider the Sacro Bosco built near Rome in Bomarzo by Vicino Orsini as a kind of garden of retreat, it was built from 1552 onwards as a kind of alternative city, place where life was not as corrupt as in Rome was already at that time. If one analyze it bit more precisely, you can see that that at least the elements that are in the park, you see this kind of monster figure, are the same elements that you find in this case, the illustrations of a book that was what we would call a bestseller at that time, the Hypnotomachia Polyphili, written by Francesco Colonna in 1499, where Colonna, it's a kind of parable and a dream. That's why Hypnotomachia, and he describes and illustrates, or somebody illustrates it for him. He describes in this dream modern, at that time, modern gardens that about 50 years later Vicino will, at least in one example, realize. Or to take an example that is nearer to you, Stourhead, which is one of the major English landscape garden, is not an imitation, but is very much inspired by the painting of the paintings of Claude Lorrain, and specifically Aeneas on Delos, which you can see here. You can see that the Pantheon that is here is a kind of replica of the Pantheon that that Lorrain paints. And if you look closer, you can see that this kind of Palladian bridge here is almost exactly the Palladian bridge that you have in Stourhead. Again, there are also more modern examples. Tony Garnier, the creator of the cité, of this vision of the modern city, the cité industrielle of 1914, 16, of which you can see here a detail, was inspired in a very direct way by a novel by Émile Zola called Le Travail. And what you see here is a sketch that Zola himself did in order to write his novel. And this is a kind of new socialist city. And this new socialist city will find an architectural form in this vision by Tony Garnier. And Tony Garnier will acknowledge his cultural debt to Zola by showing, by inscribing in this kind of concrete attica of the main central building of the Cité Industrielle, quotes from Zola's novel. And also modern painting has been influential to modern architecture. The so-called città di fondazione that were built by the Italian fascist regime in the 30s, especially in the Pontinian swamps, where, or at least their architecture and also the idea of public space was very much influenced by the idea of public space that you can find in the paintings by Giorgio de Chirico or Carlo Carrà, that were much earlier, starting from 1914, 15. Actually, this is a painting from 1913. So, all this to try to convey the idea that there are many different influences to be taken, to be considered, coming from very different disciplines, to be considered if one wants to understand the city, and to show that the history of urban architecture is in a way inextricably linked with the history of society as a whole, with all this complexity of politics, economy, law, technology, literature, painting, and sculpture. Of course, it's not always the case that there is that all influences come all together in the same way. They always change. But I think you have to analyze or to consider always the whole system of influences in order then to select, according to the specific historical case, what was really the important influence for this specific urban situation. This on the one hand. On the other hand, it would be a big mistake, I think, to believe that the form of a city is in a way simply dependent from, let's say, one of these influences. For instance, that the form of the city and its social structure possess similar similar or comparable structure. One of the most common ideas is that that if a city has an ordered formal structure, then society in the city must also be as ordered and the formal structure. This is, I think, not true at all. And I show you just a few grid cities to show how completely different social structure have nestled into the very same architectural or urban form. Here you see, for instance, Tell el Amarna. It's a workers' housing quarter in Egypt, 1,350 before Christ. A very authoritarian, centralized society, obviously, and you can compare it up to a certain degree, obviously only, to Priene around 300 before Christ. As we know, one of the first democratic political system, similar in a way to our terms of democracy, only similar, obviously. Or to continue with these grid cities, Verona, seen from the sky, the Roman grid is very easily detectable. Verona was a Roman foundation, but of course the Roman city was not was not comparable to Priene or to the Egyptian workers' housing. And the same goes on the right for Grenade-sur-Garonne. It's one of the Bastide, one of these medieval cities that have been founded mostly for military reason on a very strong, clear grid, and with very different social structures. And to finish up this, again a grid city, Guadalajara, in Mexico in 1900, a colonial city, so another problem, completely different problem. And then to the right, the commissioner's plan for New York, for Manhattan, as planned before Central Park. Again, a completely different idea of in a way, rational exploitation of the land. All grid cities, completely different political systems. We have been talking all the time about, actually I've been talking all the time, about the city, about the architecture, to be more precise, about the architecture of the city. I think that there is a problem in distinguishing at this time between urban planning and architecture. It's not easy to distinguish because every building that is located in a city, in a way, is bound to take an urban planning aspect, simply because it's there, simply because it has a relationship with its neighbor, and because it, in a way, influences the urban space. So every building in a city is, if you want or not, a piece of urban planning. Of course, there are examples that are much more explicit. For instance, the buildings of that were the building type that were developed for the Paris of the 19th century. They were developed as much as in order to create this very clear urban grid with point of views and with straight streets, as to create apartments of this kind, of this type, bourgeois apartments that would, fit into this big, big city mold, if I may say so. There are also cases of single buildings that become a part of urban planning. When Ferdinando Fuga started intervening in Naples, for instance, around the middle of the 18th century, what he did was a whole system of buildings. You see here the Albergo dei Poveri, which you can see here. Another intervention that he did were the Granili, and then approximately in this place here, a bit higher, there was a cimitero of the 366 Fosse. In a way, he built three big buildings in order to change completely the image and the idea and also the function of the city, because of course the poor people, that's what the Albergo dei Poveri was there for, would have to live here. They would be fed through the granili, through this deposit of wheat, grain, whatever, food in any case, and after that they would be buried in this cemetery. That was a cemetery only for poor people. The same idea of a relation, but much more explicit, obviously, the same idea of single buildings put into a very specific relation you can find in the capital of Chandigarh by Le Corbusier. And this sketch shows, I think, very nicely the relationship between the single building and, of course, between the monument of the open hand, creating, in a way, immaterial, just visual relations that are, however, I think, very clearly urban relations. Then there are buildings that are cities, very simply. I go back to the Albergo dei Poveri by Fuga. It's really a city for 8,000 people, divided in a very crude, rational way. Woman, man, I don't know if it's the correct place, boys and girls, and here's a church in the middle, and like a panopticon, by the way, and the system here was done in such a way that nobody would ever meet. I mean, no woman would ever meet another a man or a girl, or because when they met, it was quite horrible, and not for the reason that you think about. And in a way, the same idea of a big building as constructed as a city, even with the infrastructure, is of course the Unité d'Habitation in Marseille by Le Corbusier. So there are also individual buildings designed to be kind of self-contained small towns. There are also some curious cases where a single building mutates into an urban district. It's the case, the most famous case is Diocletian's Palace that you can see here in a reconstruction. And this palace you can find again here in the city of Split. The big palace has, in medieval time, has been occupied by people who wanted to live there, and it is so big and it's constructed in a way like a city that its corridors has turned into streets and its rooms into houses. and it has become really part. You can see very. This is the an addiction. It has really become the core and part of of the city. And there are others examples like in Lucca, but this is true for many Italian cities, where the amphitheater that you can see here or you can see here has been Roman amphitheater, Roman foundation. The city is degraded, and then people start using this big structure that is no use anymore because there are no fights anymore. Using this big structure, to construct their shops, their apartments, and so on. And by the way, only later, only in the 18th century, this part that had been full of houses, completely full of houses, has been turned again into something else, a public space, which it wasn't, of course, a public space for the city, and the walls of the theater are still the houses that you can recognize very easily in the plan of the city. That much for the distinction, for the, I admit, unclear distinction. I think it's important to keep it in a way unclear between architecture and urban planning. The same goes for the distinction between a city and a garden. You have very famous examples of the city of Richelieu. The city is here. This is the castle. This is the park. City and park are constructed in 1634 as a kind of mythology for Richelieu, who probably never owned this castle and probably never was born there, but as a kind of complete unity, or an Italian Renaissance garden like the Villa d'Este here has been used as a kind of model for an urban structure. This all becomes very clear in Versailles, where Lenôtre, using his or designing his gardens, designs at the same time. This is a castle. Designs according to the same rules, also the city of Versailles, and this elements of the gardens, the straight streets, the round squares, and so on, are transferred into what is at first still a fictive plan of Paris, by Pierre Pat, meaning that these elements that in a way are tested almost in a garden, then are used as elements of urban planning in a real city. First, again in Versailles, and then in Paris. If you analyze it even more precisely, you see that it's even more complex because it's a kind of ping pong between the city and the garden. But finally, Marc-Antoine Laugier will then declare in his famous manifesto that a city should be built like a garden, and he will ask for a new Lenôtre to come and to design to do a decent city plan. Now we have this idea of a city with admittedly very complex relationships. In order to, as this would not be enough, I think that in order to understand the city better, you don't have only to understand the topography, this material facts, why a city comes into being, not only the influences that come together, but you have also to look a little bit around at, let's say, some detours in a way. For instance, I think that a painting by Tiro La Francesca, like the Flagellazione that you see here, or one of the all three famous tavolette, they were probably just we don't even know who did them. They're probably just theater sets or drawings of theater sets. I think that they explain, in a way, they show the essence of what the Renaissance city was. The Renaissance city, as it was never built by nobody in this pure form, made of single standing volumes in very strict relation with very important open spaces, for instance. Or I think that reading the books or looking at the paintings, by the way, by Victor Hugo, one can understand the Paris. Here you have La Ville qui dort, and here you have Notre Dame, which is a major subject of one of his novels. You can understand a lot more about 19th century Paris than just analyzing Haussmann's interventions. And finally, if you look at a film like Godard, Deux trois choses que je sais d'elle, I think that it tells you a completely different and very articulated story about the Ville Nouvelle that had been constructed around Paris in the 60s, showing in a very detailed way the squalor, of course, but also a kind of subtle fascination by that this infrastructure, these big structures give. Enough slides. Let me recall the definition that I proposed earlier. Historical insight is given when a question regarding the past is posed from the standpoint of the present and answered in a scientific way. So the first thing that one has to pose in analyzing a city is a question. And in a way, the formulation of the question inherently bears already at least a part of the answer. I think that a historian should proceed, historian of urban planning, but not only of urban planning, should proceed like Sherlock Holmes in one of the detective stories or like Arsène Lupin in one of the very first detective stories. Should start by a hypothesis. You know the stories. The police, something has happened, crime has happened, the police rushes around, there is a lot of evidence and many facts, and the detective does not pay so much attention to these facts. He develops a theory. He develops a theory based on the crime, based on the great criminalistic paradigm, and then weights this hypothesis against the evidence that is really there. I think that is what we should do first. We have to pose a precise question on the basis of a universal theory. The problem is which theory. I think you need, in a way, two theories. You need your own theory of what you think all this is about. And then you need to analyze, for instance, I don't know, the Ville Nouvelle, you need to go into the theories that the people building the Ville Nouvelle had developed from themselves. It's no use analyzing, I don't know, the Ville Nouvelle using Ebenezer Howard's theory of the Garden City, because it's something completely different, and it's completely misleading, and it would be completely biased. And the questions that you have to ask about the theory are not, do I agree with this theory or not, but are, do these theories possess an inner logic? do they correspond to the relationship of their time? Are they convincing as they are applied? And of course, we all judge from our point of view, from today's point of view, but we shouldn't judge too rashly. And then, once the theory, the analysis of the theory is done, we should, like the detective, go and look at the facts. In one of Dorothy Sayers' novels, a police officer says facts are like cows. If you look at them long enough, they will go away, which is quite true, but also quite slightly, I would say, exaggerated. I think that the history of urban planning, like every history, consists in not paying too much attention to the facts. But once you want to verify your theory with the facts, then you have to be very precise and very accurate and very and very clear. And this brings us to the third, and of course the most important step in the quest for historical insight. The question has been posed, the sources are examined. Now the question is or the problem is to examine the sources critically. And in doing so I think that every historian cannot but take a very clear stance. Only somebody who has an opinion can analyze and above all criticize, and only somebody who's able and willing to state this opinion very very clearly. The important thing is to make a very clear distinction in your historical work, the distinction between the so-called facts, those who disappear like cows, and your own opinion and your own criticism. This has to be taken apart very, very clearly, and this is, I think, all the more important in a school. I think that students should not be just simply crammed with facts, with data, with knowledge. They should be taught to use this knowledge, this data, and this facts. And I think that without a firm foundation of a basic knowledge, there can be no worthwhile analysis. But still, the teacher's interpretation should not be adopted without reflection or just continue it. The teacher's interpretation should, in a way, this is a bit idealistic, but it should inspire other divergent and even contradictory interpretation. I think that only in this way there can be progress in research and vitality in theory. In this respect, the history of urban planning must also defend itself against dogmatism. It must encourage the exploring of myths and the breaking of spells, which is, I mean, this act of destroying perhaps the most noble and most lasting heritage of enlightenment. Above all, however, it must turn against what I think is the worst dogmatism of our time, the dogmatism of relativism, which declares all things relative except relativity, and all things replaceable except the perfidious myth of replaceability. I think we have to contribute through our precise analysis of what happened and still happens in city planning, and through a very personal stance to reassorting what we think are our values. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's a fantastic amount of material in relatively short period of time, and all of it extremely concise. I'm sure there'll be questions specifically in relation to this question of the latter relationship.
I would be curious about the definition of city, though. You said in the beginning you would have one.
Yes. As I say, I would propose as a definition of city. Well, in English, it's very difficult to do it, but I will try. A substantial amount of buildings on a territory that has a certain permanence. With these buildings will show in themselves the functional differentiation of the use. The city should be or is in a way the center of its territory. It has major political, administrative, and economical functions in this very territory, and it is interlocked with an international network. It is rather similar, by the way, but not altogether, with Max Weber's definition. Max Weber defines a city through its economical power, and he explained that the city, he explains, to put it very simply, the city as a marketplace. I think it's not enough. It's not my phone. I think it's not enough because there are many cities, or there are in history marketplaces that are just not cities, as we understand. But I mean, this definition is what I offer to you. It's something that, and I mean, it's not just kind of artificial modesty. I think that these definitions really need to be redefined and modified while we go on with our research.
I was very intrigued by this, by the analysis in the end, when you were discussing the relationship between data, information, the idea of knowledge, knowing, and the role of the detective. And somehow it would be, I think, very good if you could elaborate a little bit on this idea, because if I understand it correctly, you are suggesting that, well, maybe it's not so important to pay a lot of attention to all the details, but once you make a decision to pay attention, it's very important to be precise. Now, from the beginning, you're constructing, in a sense, a kind of a historical project with very specific themes that are there in terms of the history of the city itself. How do you, in terms of the method that you have constructed for the analysis of the city, what is the method for the construction of, let's say, contemporary cities? What is the relationship between the idea of making or constructing towards urbanism or towards city now in relation to this historical project that you are presenting?
Tricky question. No, it's a tricky. It's a very important. I mean, it's in a way it's a crucial question, and it's a very difficult question because I think that history cannot be used as a kind of reservoir of shapes and forms, neither to create architecture nor to create a city. But what I do think is that if we don't analyze, and that's in a way what I would like to do, if we don't analyze just forms of the city, but if we analyze strategies of how some problems have been solved in the past, then out of these strategies, and not of the formal result of the strategies, out of this we are able, so I hope at least, to learn something from history for a contemporary project.
But if I understand it correctly, where someone like Colin Rowe was suggesting in terms of the idea of collage city, also formally this reference to this historical material as part of the project of making the city new, you're not, in a sense, proposing that line of argument. You're suggesting more the relational and strategic conditions rather than formal ideas of the city. Is that a fair assessment? Or I'm trying to understand where the relationship between form and the kind of, strategic decisions, how those two things come together.
That's absolutely fair, and I mean I wouldn't have any problems in using personally. I mean now in my architecture, I wouldn't have any problems in using the same forms, urban forms, architectural forms, for if I had a problem that is exactly the same problem than, let's say, I don't know, Domenico Fontana had when working for Sixtus V. Well, no Sixtus V around, completely different problems, or at least slightly different problems, and therefore I think that out of necessity, I don't want to seem too much of a functionalist, but out of sheer necessity, we have to invent forms. I'm against invention. I shouldn't say this in this school, but I'm against invention for invention's sake. But I think that our contemporary conditions just forces us to invent. I can show you one example. I won't show you the slides. We can be sure. But we are, for instance, designing a square now. Wonderful thing for somebody doing history of urban planning. And it's a square where where people want to go and so on. So the first idea was, we do a square like every wonderful Italian city has in its center. But it's a square, not for a real city, but for an automobile industry, or for a kind of city for an automobile industry. It's a square where some very strange thing happens. Car comes out, car that you buy, you buy your car and then you come out. And it's like Domenico Fontana. It's a kind of ritual that you do, but you don't go to church. You go to the restaurant, and you don't go by foot. You go with a car. So for all this, something I think we have to invent something. And in fact, we are trying.
Question like that, maybe you can pass the microphone.
Yeah, I have certain queries about the relationship that you set up between description and theory. I mean, you speak of separate categories and demarcation of facts, the political, the economic, topographical, and so on. And you speak of amassing facts and then finding theoretical explanations for these facts. Well, the first thing, is there actually such a clear demarcation between facts and theory? I mean, philosophers say that all facts are theory-laden, and there isn't a clear demarcation between facts and theory. But my question is rather this. You speak of a universal theory. That was your term. So would your aspiration with urban history be to find a universal theory that explains urban form applicable to all cities everywhere, or would this universal theory be applicable to one city, or further down, would this theory be applicable to one city in terms of its, say, economic history or its political history? I mean, I'm interested in this idea of a universal theory and what you're going to do with it.
I think at least that I use this term universal theory for the detectives and not for the urban for the urban planners. Trying to what I want to say is that if one has a detective case or an urban case, he should look for a theoretical framework that goes much beyond the specific case, and that in a way relies or is constructed on many other cases. But I think there is no universal theory of urban planning for the very simple reason that theory is completely dependent from history, and since history changes, theory changes too. And that's in a way what I tried to explain when I said today even if I agree very much with Adolf Loos when he said you should do something new only when it's better, but I think we need to invent new forms just because history has changed.
Perhaps I would just start by saying that I enjoyed your comparison to the detective and kind of comparing the situation of a contemporary architect to a detective. And perhaps in relation to that, I want to ask a question. Because it seems to me what happens with a detective, and he's, as it were, in a situation to start working on a case, is not that he immediately has like a theory which is like completely different from, as it were, what obvious facts suggest to the police. It's just that he actually has something which appears like a very fragile thing to start with, which is usually a clue. Something like a simple clue which is quite, appears in the context of a detective novel, quite unimportant. So it happens then that clue triggers, little by little, a series of openings that will address the problem. Okay, and the problem is there, the question is there, like who has done it or whatever. Okay, so it seems to me, it's not that, that we are in a situation, that architect or detective in a situation that he completely separately sort of resorts to some kind of theory, but he actually works in a quite gradual way on the basis of something like a clue or a series of clues that sort of almost kind of open up a series of possible answers. And it seems to me that's a situation in which perhaps both architectural historians are when they are sort of doing a research in relation to the city, architectural theorists, though the question is different, but to some extent, and this is partly perhaps our answer to Moisen, architects when they design, they also perhaps work on a basis of gradual development of the theory, but which is actually not sort of given sort of after a kind of serious thought, but on the basis of serious clues that in a way lead towards a better formulation of problem and perhaps a kind of, at the end, a hypothesis or a theory which is to be proved at the end. I don't know. This is more like a comment rather than a question. What do you think?
No, but I agree absolutely. I think that your idea of a clue is a very crucial idea, because you need a thread to take, and the clue is given by intuition on the one hand, and by knowing many cases that were similar to that, to the one that is happening, and knowing that this small detail might lead possibly to somewhere. And in a way, I think that's exactly what, as a historian, you have to do, or you need to do, because I mean, I try to open up a bit the horizon of what a city is and can be. But it's very clear that if you look at all this, at the same time, it's so many data, it's so much information that you can't do anything with it. Absolutely, you're completely paralyzed. And so you need to start somewhere, and you can start only if you have a clue, I agree, and if you have a theory. If you think, if you decide this city could be could be something dependent from an idea of painting, I don't know, and then you can analyze it, and if the clue is a good one, then you can verify your theory, and if the clue is a bad one, then you can falsify it, and you find out that's not true. But it's better to find out it's not true than just get lost in an enormous amount of material.
Well, I've got two questions and I can't separate them in my mind, so I'll just say the one that comes into my head first. Len Creer had this idea that after 1834 nothing was good anymore. 1834 was the date he picked. After that, industry had a malign effect on society and things don't complete themselves. And yet, Schroeder's plan for Barcelona was devised in the mid-century, and it's built, and it's the city of Barcelona now. Whereas Corbusier's city for 2 million has never been built. Is there some relationship between the economic effort, the resources that must be put into a city, and the time it takes to deploy them, and the fact that ideal cities are no longer possible? Or is that a fact?
It's many questions, and it's no way 3 questions, and quite difficult ones. I mean, I don't know. You know, for instance, the Barcelona of Cerdà has been built by a series of misunderstandings. I mean, Serdar thought, for instance, he cut the edges of his blocks. Well, first of all, to create nicer spaces, nicer visual relations, but also because he was convinced that they would build a trolley, working with trams working with steam, and they would need, to get along the curves, and therefore the house had to be cut, which obviously did not happen. Then Serdar had his idea of Barcelona was an idea of a green city. I mean, his idea was that the blocks should be built only on two sides and the rest should be garden. Maybe you can remember seeing it on the plan. As you all know, Barcelona has been built in a completely different way. But the plan was so strong, the idea of the plan was so strong that it survived in a way all these misunderstandings. With Le Corbusier, I don't know, the problem with the Plan Voisin, or with the Ville Contemporaine, maybe, is that it did not survive the misunderstandings, because there are many pieces of the Ville Contemporaine that have been built, but it just don't work. I'm not sure that the Ville Contemporaine, as conceived by Le Corbusier, would not work. I'm not really sure, but it's not there. We cannot. I mean, we can speculate, but it's not there.
Well, that was a very interesting answer. Can I now give you my second question?
Sure.
The second question is about the city as language. We were all very interested when Chomsky gave up his attempt to roboticize a natural language. He said it's not fair. Babies learn to speak without being taught, but my robot keeps making mistakes. There were so many exceptions, he couldn't roboticize English. Do you think that the complexity of language, we have whole university departments studying the way we speak and trying to devise a theory about how the rules work and so on. Do you think that that is similar to cities, and that cities are in some sense a language which we don't understand fully?
In a way, yes. I mean, because like language, they have not only, language has also logical structure. Cities have also logical structure. But since they are so linked with history and with human life, very simply, they have so many illogical sides that I think they're really difficult to plan. I think that in theory it would be possible, but I just think that we are not capable, because the complexity is such that we cannot deal with all this. And when we try, we fail, but not because it's impossible by definition. It's impossible because we are not good enough.
Yeah, I think so. I'm rather glad that Chomsky failed in an attempt to roboticize English, it was, a natural language. And this is, I guess, there's a fear here that if we could reproduce ourselves, then we would come confused between ourselves and our creations. It's a sort of fear that surfaces, for instance, with the idea of cloning. Though people are completely confused, some people think that if they could get a clone made of themselves, then they could live longer in the clone. So it's a very confused area where the individual stops, where the group begins, and what is the domain of the individual in relation to the group. And my own feeling about this is hardly a theory, is that we are not fully aware how much of everybody there is in each of us as an individual. And this, in a way, is why the city and our own language remain complex and a mystery to us. So I'm glad we haven't discovered the answers as yet.
When you speak about language, it also refers then back to the idea of the structure of that language, or do you mean that in the sense of the kind of narrations of cities that have been and the ones that are yet to become, or some such thing?
Well, Calvino and the Invisible Cities is part of it as an overlap. But for instance, the theory of language, the theory of communication, gave rise to the idea of a universal language and a universal theory. Esperanto. Who speaks Esperanto has not succeeded as a universal language. You continue to have languages which are full of misunderstandings and overlaps. And I have a feeling that this lack of universal theory is somehow linked to the feeling we have that when a species disappears, and they're disappearing every week, we lose something. A species, what is a species in terms of language?
Could I say from the rear, Tom, it's a council of despair that you're offering. I mean, I was thought that, can I say that I think it's a council of despair? One, I don't see that there is a logical power between theories of language and theories of the system. Two, I do think it's vitally important that we understand more by way of explanation of the forces that shape our system, because of the enormous problems that mankind is confronted with in the 21st century, not least the ecological. So I mean, your seeming celebration of the idea that we don't understand the phenomena, I think, frankly, is a council of despair. I really do think it's necessary for us to try and understand the phenomena so as to be able to grapple with these immense problems that in the 21st century humankind is facing. And architecture and city planning and all of the professions involved in these things really must find not necessarily solutions, but they must be able to pose questions that we've been hearing tonight. They must be able to pose questions that do offer some sense of forward direction. So I don't share your, as I say, your celebration of the idea of the non-accessibility, the non-resolution of these things. I think these are vitally important areas that need attention.
Well, I agree with you in a way, but on the other hand, it's not possible to say that the world has progressed in an absolute sense. For instance, the 20th century has seen as much unkindness and persecution and horrors of men to men than any era. And so one has to be very skeptical about all positivistic thinking. Of course, science is progressing all the time. Science is progressing. But it seems to me that as science progresses and we rise higher, something else sinks down and we drop lower. So we never actually get better. We just remain human, except that the things we're doing are slightly different. That's my...
I'm not skeptical.
I like the idea of gardens being used in the past as testing grounds for city patterns. I was wondering if this is still possible today. I mean, for example, maybe the Americans have Hollywood to do it, but can Europe do it somewhere? I don't know, maybe like a lab city to try future patterns? Is this possible?
I think yes, and I also think that in a way it does happen. Personally, I mean, I give it for what it's worth, but I think, for instance, that the Parc de la Villette project by Alan Koolhaas was exactly that. It was a testing ground, and a very brilliant one, by the way, even if I tend to disagree with his basic urban ideas, a testing ground for a new city. Exactly. I mean, it didn't happen, as you know, it didn't materialize, but it was exactly that. I think it's quite possible. I was very interested in your internal discussion going on. I think that a possible solution between the problems is in the fact that I think that we have to agree that there is no, in a way, ideal city in terms of an ideal architectural solution to living with people. And I think that once if we succeed in agreeing on that, and if we see our cities as something that we have not to invent from scratch, which was a real problem with the Corbusier, as something that we can add to in bits and pieces, but we have to in a way to integrate in a whole context. And then I think that the problem is not as your problem is not as dramatic. I really think we have not the tools to understand clearly how a city works, because it's so incredibly irrational. I recently read a wonderful analysis that was done in the 60s of the especially economical and architectural situation in New York. It was a very big research project with many distinguished experts, and at that time they had very clear evidence that New York would in a way implode and destroy itself because what was already happening at that time, or already had happened in Harlem and then in the Bronx, would go down into Manhattan and in a way, yes, turn everything into a Carpenter film set. As we know, I mean, something different has happened, but the evidence was all there. It was, I mean, I was completely convinced. Only that the city is different, and I think that the real problem is to understand the whole organism of a city as a whole. But what I think we can do is we should do is we can plan parts of the city, and in this part of the city we can and should express in a very clear and also radical way, in a very clear-cut way, what we think is good for or possible in our time. I think that's how the interesting cities, interesting big cities of the world have come into being as a kind of patchwork of an addition of very different cities coexisting, one at the side of the other.
I wanted to comment on this idea of language and cities, and the beauty of great cities is their poetry and their contradiction, and they're continually multi-layered, and they're continually developing, and they're never resolved. And English, as a language that we all speak, is continually evolving. It's never resolved, and it's totally contradictory in so many ways. And although we occasionally understand a part of it, and there are different bits that we understand, the way that we get the joy is by continually returning to it and rediscovering and finding new depths and new parts of it. And that we shouldn't try and resolve the city, because in resolving it, we'll destroy it.